Hello and welcome to the Ditton Works YouTube channel and 2023. I hope everybody had a thoroughly enjoyable Christmas and celebrated the new year in style. I'm here today because I'm going to review another set of isolation feet. I reviewed the ISO Acoustics Gaia feet some months ago, which I've used on my Spendor Classic 2.3s ever since. They made a massive improvement to the tonal qualities of those loudspeakers. They really tightened up the bass, they cleaned up the mid-range. It was a really interesting experiment and they worked so well. I bought them, kept them, and I've used them ever since. So today we're going to have a look at a different take on isolation feet from a company called Solidair Audio. Let's have a chat about them. So as you can see, they come in a lovely tin. And the set we're going to look at today are the Darkstar 38. Now, all of Solidair Audio's products are available for you to view on their website. I will put a link to the website in the comments section below. But just firstly, I mean, this tin, it's just fantastic. It's just great to get a proper old school tin. And you get the full set of feet, and you also get little cork pads that I guess you would use if you were using them on a wooden floor. I'm using them on carpet, so I've opted not to use the cork feet, but that is just quality. I love that. Proper tin. And so yeah, we've got the 8 Darkstar 38 feet with the 6mm threads. Now my friend Matt O'Donoghue sent me these. I didn't get them direct from Solidair Audio, and that meant he'd already pre-selected the thread size. Now, I would have used them on my Kingstons, but the threads were wrong. And rather than messing around getting different sets of isolation feet sent around, I decided to try them on my Celestion SL600s. Now, these speakers are from 1985. I've had countless sets of them. This is a more recent set that I've refurbished. They had completely blown drive units and cut crossovers, so I completely rebuilt them. Now, part of the reason I've selected these is over the years I have had dozens of pairs of SL600s. Now, they do have, some people find them faults. They are very rolled off in the top end and they don't have the deeper space extension. But what they do incredibly well, I said do there, didn't I? What they do incredibly well is imaging. Their imaging is phenomenal. It's described as holographic. Now, although the Celestion Kingston's imaging, HF extension and LF extension far exceeds the SL600s, I couldn't use them with these threads. So I'm going to go with a pair of speakers that I know inside out very well, had them for years, and experiment with these Solidair Darkstar feet. Let's have a chat what I thought about them. So first up, what do isolation feet really do? Well, let me show you. They allow quite a lot of wobbling around. And this is really interesting because back in the day, everybody thought that spikes were the way to go. Now, I've got to admit, and I said this on the ISO Acoustics review as well, that when I first spiked a pair of loudspeakers, I must say I noticed an improvement. And my opinion was that they were sure-footed, they were planted into the ground, and it meant less energy was being lost while they were just wobbling about on the carpet. So spikes seemed to make sense. But I had to completely rethink that when I tried the ISO Acoustics feet, which allowed this wobbling. And I think ultimately, I came up with the idea that rather than them affecting what some people called seismic activity, which would then affect the sort of frequency, not the frequency response, but the output would be affected by vibrations, I thought what was actually happening was the other way around, that the isolation feet were stopping the vibrations travelling into the floor, which was essentially saving a bit of energy. It was stopping the energy travelling right through the floor, and the floor is often an area which we don't consider. Most people talk about side reflections off the walls or off the ceiling, but the floor is also an area of reflection, and it's also the only area where the speaker is in direct contact with any of the surfaces. So the floor is actually quite important, and these isolation feet knock out some of that energy being transmitted into the floor. Now, how that affects the signal, I would imagine that it would reduce bass energy, and there is a possibility that is still happening. But how that affects us psychoacoustically is it gives you the impression of a tighter, more controlled bass, which then cleans up the mid-range, which in turn then cleans up the HF. Now, in the case of the Spendor Classic 2.3s, that completely and utterly worked. I then used the Townsend super tweeters to clean up the HF further, which in effect cleaned up top down. So I ended up with a very, very nice sounding pair of loudspeakers. Very happy with the Spendor Classic 2.3s in that setup. Now, the SL600s were planted into the floor on spikes, and I'm very familiar with how they sounded, and I thought they sounded pretty good. I am a fan of Celestion speakers, hence Dittonworks. Although recently I have taken purchase of Celestion Kingstons, which are the absolute flagship in the SL range, and even spiked into the floor, sound remarkably better than SL600s in every sense, apart from one. The depth of soundstage on the Kingston isn't quite as good or as deep as the SL600. If anybody's interested, read Ken Kessler's review on the Celestion Kingston. He does describe them as somewhat small sounding loudspeakers. They never sound big, which in effect is caused by the not lack of depth in the soundstage, but they haven't got the deepest soundstage, so they're not presenting themselves in a depth kind of way, as where the 600s do, and I've always liked them for that. So attaching these isolation feet on there did have an impact on the sound, which I will explain in a minute. A little bit about the feet themselves. So the Darkstar feet themselves are quite interesting. If you look, I'll put some pictures up as I'm talking through this, but as you look through them, there's like a network or thread going through the actual body of the feet, which is what allows that floating situation. And instead of it being a spring, which it is in most isolation feet, you've actually got what I only describe as a web that is allowing the point of contact to have this complete freedom. So it's free to move around in most directions. Now, the real advantage with these feet is they can handle each foot 50 kilos. So with the isolation feet from Isoacoustics, you had to go up in spec, so from Gaia 3 to Gaia 2 to Gaia 1 if your loudspeakers were heavier. Now, the Kingstons are considerably heavier than the Spendor Classic 2.3s, so I would need at least Gia 2s. I can get away with 3s on the Spendor Classic 2.3s. Although the SL600s are not very heavy, the stands are lead filled, so they are heavy. They're approaching, I think they're 25, 30, maybe 30 kilos. So you'd be at the upper limit of the Isoacoustics feet, meaning I'd probably have to move up in spec of feet. The same with my Target stands. They're very heavy. They're closer to 50 kilos because they're lead filled. So the advantage you've got is if each foot can handle up to 50 kilos, when you've got 4 of them or even 3 of them in the case of the Kingston, that 50 kilos is distributed over all of the feet, meaning they can handle quite a lot of weight, which is a bonus. They're not too expensive, or you're not having to spend more to cater for the higher weight. And these 4 feet here at their 50 kg load each, spread over the 4 on these stands which are lead filled, they're easily able to handle it. It's not suddenly sagging down. Now, I must admit, my turntable, I can't remember what a SL1210 weighs, but when I put my ISON isolation feet on there, they definitely sagged down. It was almost like they were nearly at the limit of what those feet could handle. And I've certainly not experienced that with these Solidair audio feet. So that's a real bonus. So let's now talk about how they affected the sound. So as I've mentioned before, I believe that these isolation feet knock out some of the energy being sent into the floor. And logic would dictate that it would reduce the bass output. Now, one of the complaints that most people have about the Celestion SL series is they're not the most bassy loudspeakers in the world. Well, they aren't. That's a 6.5 inch bass unit. It's never going to be hugely bassy. However, They aren't that bad when it comes to bass if driven to acceptable levels with the right amplification. But one thing I did notice when I added these feet was they actually sounded a lot nicer in the bass. It had cleaned up that bass. It wasn't that it was necessarily deeper, although it gave the illusion that it was just cleaner. There was more punch, there was more definition to the bass. It was certainly more enjoyable. Now, mid-range is something that SL series speakers have never had an issue with. They're incredibly clean in the mid-band. And experimenting with various different tracks, I found with the addition of these Solidair audio feet that the mid-band was actually cleaned up as well. Now, whether that's just part and parcel of the bass being cleaned up, that it just naturally helps with that mid-range, that's a possibility. Now, one of the areas of complaints that most had even back in the day with the SL600 is that copper tweeter is so rolled off they don't have loads and loads of HF detail. Well, I don't mind a rolled off HF. I would certainly rather have a more subdued HF than I would an incredibly clangy, bright HF that some metal dome tweeters are known for. You certainly don't get that with these. It's very pleasant. Again, if driven at reasonable volume levels with a good enough amplifier to get a grip on the loudspeakers, I've found that there's more than enough HF for me with the SL600s. I will admit the aluminium tweeters certainly play a more detailed sound and are a better loudspeaker at lower volume because the HF unit is just that much more efficient. But we haven't got those to test at the minute. So HF on these with the Solidair audio feet, again, is it just that the bass is cleaned up, which helps the mid, which then helps the HF? That's a possibility. But I certainly felt that these were very pleasant in the HF. These feet are obviously doing something. Now, when I had a chat with the guy who owns Solidair Audio and the guy who developed these isolation feet, he told me of a very interesting experiment that he conducted. I can't repeat that because I'm on a ground floor, but what he did was set up a pair of loudspeakers on a second floor with spikes or just onto the floor and measured the SPL reading in the room below. He then repeated the experiment with the isolation feet in place and detected a 4 dB drop in sound coming through into the room below. Now, how he explained it is rather than there being that thuddy bass, he could actually hear it as proper music. Now that's very interesting because that means that that energy being transferred through the floor is not just the big thuddy low frequency notes, that it's cleaned it up, it's stopped that being transmitted into the floor, allowing, weirdly, even in the room below, to hear the music more coherently. So that's got to support the theory that they stop energy being transferred into the floor. Now, as interesting an experiment as it was, not many people I know listen to music in the ground floor with their stereo on the second floor, although I have heard stories of audiophiles listening to their hi-fi in the next room or in the hallway where it sounds best. I'd rather be in the room present with the speakers and the hi-fi personally. But the experiment was worthwhile doing, and it does give us some information that definitely these isolation feet from Solidair Audio don't allow all the thuddy low frequency energy to travel into the floor, meaning that it does clean it up for the listener. So yet again, a very different style of isolation feet, but very much doing what they're supposed to do, improving the sound. So in a nutshell, which seems to be my catchphrase now, in a nutshell, I really endorse isolation feet. And I really like these ones from Solidair Audio. The packaging is incredibly good. The website is very detailed. And, excuse me, you can look through the website. There's a Facebook page. There's all the information you could possibly need. And I love that. That's a small company doing things properly because you guys can now investigate it for yourself and see what you think of it, rather than just taking my word for it. So, in a nutshell, yet again, isolation feet are doing their job and I really like them. I would definitely keep these feet on these loudspeakers because they work absolutely brilliantly. Okay guys, take care. I hope you guys have a brilliant 2023. I'll catch up with you soon.